So in much the same way as interprofessional conflict between physicians and surgeons occurred in the 18th century, when they looked for recognition in a charter, or when apothecaries were finally achieved legislation in 1815, the later 19th century saw the campaign for the registration of midwives take place against a background where delivery of safer childbirth and a reduction of maternal and infant mortality framed a debate as to who should control labour and regulate female practitioners. Medical men, particularly poor law medical officers, feared that the elevation of the status of midwife would create another grade of obstetric practitioner which would harm their practice. The campaign for registration was both protracted and divisive, complicated by the shifting and varied aspirations of participating parties, each with their own self-interests and allegiances. The idea of engaging a trained midwife had its roots in 1870s, when the Registrar General, William Farr's figures began to highlight the extent of maternal and infant mortality. Institutions such as the Obstetrical Society in London, the Rotunda, the Coombe in Dublin, hospitals in Edinburgh and Glasgow trained midwives. The reality of providing instruction to women in small, isolated rural villages who were poorly paid for their services was seen as beyond private philanthropy and one requiring state aid under the advice of the General Medical Council. The Midwives Act of 1902 was given royal assent in July of that year and came into force in April 1903. The Act established a central midwives board for England and Wales, which would regulate the issue of certificates, keep a roll of midwives, have responsibility for courses of training and examinations, provide for the suspension of practitioners, and generally supervise the effective administration of the profession. Power to supervise midwives at a local level was given to county and borough councils, who held records of local practitioners and were to report on any suspected episodes of malpractice. This paper focuses on the background of the Act from an Irish perspective. It will include the urgency of the 1911 National Insurance Act, which entitled holders of the policy to maternity benefit, and will also just deviate into Belfast Corporation and their regulation of midwives from 1911 to 1918, which they were able to achieve through an amendment to the Municipal Corporation Act. Sources actually for this paper came from the journals here of the College of Physicians, the Public Record of Northern Ireland, the Central Midwives Board records in UCD archives, and Mary Daly's work in the late 19th and early 20th century work on public health and mortality, and Lindsay Erna Byrne's work on maternal and infant welfare in the after 1922 actually provide a context to my primary sources. So Lom Attal, former master of the Rotunda, led a delegation from the College of Physicians to attend a government-appointed select committee in 1892, which examined the question of compulsory registration for midwives. The college contended that Irish women who wished to train as midwives were adequately served by the training institutions in Ireland, but lacked the educational capacity to belong to a registered body. The college was silent on the matter until 1897, when a third midwives bill was before Parliament. At this time, the Irish branch of the British Medical Association gave its approval for a bill once a clause had been inserted where professional misconduct included any omission to call the doctor to a case of abnormal labour. The Obstetrical Council of the Irish Academy of Medicine did not concur. It put forward a motion to the bill that was tending to create a new and inferior order of practitioner, hurtful to the interests of the profession and dangerous to the welfare of the public. But it proposed that it would approve any well-considered bill framed with a view to improving the education of women and midwifery nurses. All changed, though, in 1899, when it emerged that the bill did not include reciprocal arrangements for Irish-trained midwives. This effectively had the effect of disqualifying Irish midwives from practicing in England and Wales. As the journals of the college illustrate, many exchanges took place between the college, the framers of the bill, the Privy Council, and over the next year, many MPs were lobbied. But at the end of the day, there was no possibility that the Midwives Act would be extended to Ireland. So the English Act, however, recognised and approved 9 training institutions: the Rotunda, the Coombe, Holles Street, Sir Patrick Dunn's, the Belfast Lying-In Hospital, Cork Maternity, Cork Lying-In, and the Limerick Lying-In Hospital. What this meant was that Irish midwives trained and working in maternity hospitals here or employed by the local government board for Ireland as dispensary midwives was that there was no reciprocal arrangement for them to work in England and the colonies without going to the considerable expense of a further 3 months training and sitting the CMB exams in England or Wales. In the aftermath of the Act, it became apparent the extent to which Irish midwives would be restricted and disbarred from seeking work abroad. 3 attempts were made between 1904 and 1910 to resolve the matter. In early 1904, Alfred Smith, president of the obstetrics section of the Royal Academy of Medicine, and Hastings Tweedy, master of the Rotunda, wrote separately to the secretary of the Central Midwives Board in England, G.W. Duncan, setting out the difficulties that would be encountered by the Irish maternity hospitals in enabling their pupils to comply with rules of the board. They outlined details of the Irish method of training, the curriculum, and pleaded with the board to accept the Irish curriculum as equivalent to the CMB exams. Sir Francis Champneys, chairman of the board, replied that it regretted that the suggested alterations were not sought before notice had been given to the Privy Council of the rules, and they were already in motion, and it is impossible for the board to alter them at this stage. In October 1906, the RCPI was approached by Thomas Stafford, Medical Commission of the Irish Local Government Board, asking its views on the possibility of extending the provisions of the 1902 Act to Ireland. He proposed that, quote, possibly a short act, making it illegal for unqualified persons to practice for hire in Ireland would be sufficient for the requirements of this country and would be desirable, unquote. The College responded favourably, expressing its support for the extension of the Act, emphasising the importance of the principle of the reciprocal arrangement for the licensees of the English and Irish Midwives Board. In Parliament, Maurice Healy, member of the Irish Parliamentary Party for the Borough of Cork, asked the Chief Secretary Gladstone if he was aware that midwives, the Act at present administered by the CMB, was used as a means of preventing Irish midwives from practising in England. By December, Andrew Horn from Holles Street, Hastings Tweedy, and Henry Jellett were appointed to draft a bill on behalf of the Parliamentary Committee of the College here. By 1907, a draft bill was completed. This bill was very similar to the English Act, but with modifications to suit Irish conditions. But nothing came of the bill. By this time, the absence of an act in Ireland did not only limit Irish-trained midwives, but was beginning to reflect badly on Irish training institutions. In 1910, when amendments to the 1902 Act were being considered, the maternity hospitals, the Chief Secretary, Augustin Burrell, all had a hand in trying to secure legislation. Hastings Tweedy presented the latest available statistics on the deaths of women in pregnancy and childbirth in Ireland as compared to those in maternity hospitals. So 6.3 mothers died in rural locations and 2 per 1,000 respectively in the maternity hospitals. In England, the death rate was 4.8 per 1,000 as opposed to 6.3 here. Francis Kidd, chairman of the Leinster branch of the Irish Medical Association, was a dissenting voice, however. In a letter to the Council of the Association, he addressed the subject, stating that the proposal establishes a body of practitioners with inferior qualifications who to some extent compete with medical men, and that it fails to provide that remuneration should be given to doctors who are summoned by midwives to attend in complicated cases. A plea from the Under-Secretary of Ireland, Sir James Brown Doherty, and from the Queen Victoria Jubilee Institute of Nurses to provide facilities for written examinations here in Dublin and Cork and Belfast actually fell on deaf ears. Its reasons this time for not acceding to the request on the grounds that exams could not take place outside an area defined by the Act, and that it would be acting beyond the board's legal authority to hold exams except in centres in England and Wales. By this time, the 1911 National Insurance Act emphasised the urgency of dealing with the issue of the trained midwife. It included maternity benefit, which represented a payment of 30 shillings on the birth of a child. Overall responsibility for overseeing the implementation of the maternity provision of the Act fell largely on the local government board, not only because of its obligation through registrars to provide the insurers with a copy of the infant's birth cert, but also a marriage cert had to be submitted by the policyholder. So since qualification for benefit insisted on a trained midwife, the Irish National Insurance Commissioners adopted the same qualifications that were required by the local government board, which were qualifications that were actually put together by the Women's National Health Association in 1907. So it stated that women who were recognised by the local government board had a certificate of proficiency could, in fact, I suppose, that they could actually work in dispensaries and look after women who had a policy. And they had to be 23 years of age. So the hospitals that the local government board approved and the National Health Insurance approved were the Rotunda, the Coombe, Holles Street, Patrick Dunn's, the Belfast Maternity, the Belfast Lying In, Cork Maternity, Cork Lying In, and Limerick Lying In Hospital again. In December 1911, Belfast Corporation took matters into its own hands. The Belfast Corporation Act came into being in 1911 through an amendment of the 1834 Municipal Corporation Act. It had been introduced to Parliament through a private member's bill propelled by an amendment to the Municipal Corporations Act. The city had witnessed unprecedented growth, which saw the population increase from 71,000 in 1841 to 380,000 in 1911. At the instigation of the local health association, important public health and sanitary regulations were undertaken, which included provisions for the control and regulation of midwives. On January 1st, 1913, the powers of the corporation to control midwives practicing in the city came into being. A board was established called the Midwives Board for Belfast, modelled on the English board, with 11 members appointed, 2 more than sat on the Central Midwives Board in England. It represented all organisations in the province. There was no midwife represented. So the Act provided that no woman, unless she was certified, could attend in the city, that she couldn't purport to be a midwife, or that she would be fined if, in fact, she did. So 3 classes of midwives were entitled to claim admission to the role. The first were those who held a certificate from a lying-in hospital. Secondly, one from the local government board. And thirdly, those who were in bona fide practice. That is, that they could show that they had experience for 3 years prior to 1911. In addition to these regulations, the corporation issued a pamphlet and directions for midwives. These directions concerned the midwife's cleanliness, her dress, her instruments, the disinfection of her hands, and the steps to be taken in case the midwife came into contact with a mother suffering from puerperal fever. They dealt with the midwife's duty to her patient and to the child, and prohibited her in certain circumstances from laying out the dead. If a midwife attended a case of puerperal septicemia, she wasn't allowed to attend another maternity case until her patient either recovered or died. Then she, her clothing, her instruments were all taken to a disinfecting station in Lagenbank Road. So 8 female inspectors were engaged as health visitors. In January 1914, a female sanitary inspector with midwifery qualifications, a Miss Smith, was appointed to supervise the work of midwives. So over the period between 1913 and 1918, there were around about 200 to 220 midwives working for the corporation, either as qualified midwives or in bona fide practice. And we can see here deaths from puerperal fever and from all other in the puerperal state actually halved during that period as well. So in 1915, the Midwives Scottish Act was passed. By 1916, all stakeholders were again trying to accelerate legislation for Ireland. The IMA had relented their opposition to legislation and wrote to the college stating that it also supported a bill which would embody in a special act suitable for and made applicable to Ireland. However, while the IMA might have come round to supporting a bill, Dr. Joseph Power, a medical officer from Ardfinnan in County Tipperary, as Vice Chairman of the Poor Law Committee of medical practitioners, was highly critical of the latest initiatives. What concerned him was the clause in the Scottish Act stating that after 1922, any uncertified woman could practice only under the direction of a registered medical practitioner. Furthermore, a proposed clause in the draft bill for Ireland stated that in the Irish context, medical men who were called by the midwife would be summoned under the provisions of the Medical Charity Act, in other words, with a red dispensary ticket. The prospect of medical men, particularly in rural districts or scattered locations, being legally bound through legislation to attend normal labours where the midwife was unregistered, prompted Power to declare that there was nothing in it for the medical man except worry and trouble and a higher death rate among parturient women. Poor law medical officers who were represented by Power and others such as Horn, Kidd and Champneys who were drafting the bill had a shared objective: expulsion of the unskilled attendant from childbirth. Power made the case for a continuation of the existing situation in Ireland, but Champneys from the Central Midwives Board in England and the others were not for turning. Their only consideration was the enforcement of the law. His advice to medical men was to stick firmly to the rules. Of course, the doctor must assist the uncertified woman when summoned in an emergency. His first duty was to his patient. But this assistance was not tantamount to covering for the uncertified woman, but rather rendering assistance in a case of emergency, which the Act exonerated. The representative on the committee of the Irish branch of the BMA, R.J. Johnston, did not see how Power's desire to outlaw uncertified practitioners could be enforced, especially in isolated districts. In a conciliatory and more amusing tone, when the Act was passed, he summed up his argument by saying that Dr. Power accuses us of throwing a cloak of registration over every septic, ignorant and objectionable Sari Gamp in Ireland. And in a sense, he is right. I am sure that our committee would prefer to do what Dr. Power would himself do and prohibit every untrained woman from practice at all. But again, we had to consider what would pass a House of Commons, whether British or Irish. And when we remember that the House permitted every quack to register under the Medical Acts, every untrained tooth puller under the Dental Act, and every handywoman in England under the English Midwives Act, we could not venture to hope for a more enlightened policy in regard to Ireland. So the Midwives Act was passed in 1918, and the power of Belfast Corporation to enrol midwives lapsed on the 1st of January 1919. The rights of midwives on the corporation role in Belfast, of course, were included in the new enactment. So the new Act established a Central Midwives Board for Ireland consisting of 11 members, 7 men and 4 women, with Edward Coey-Bigger, the Medical Commissioner of the Local Government Board, as its chairman. He had just completed his report on the physical welfare of mothers and children, which stressed the urgent need for legislation for their welfare. The county and county borough councils became the local supervising authority. An important provision in the Act ensured that Irish midwives had reciprocal conditions of employment similar to midwives in Great Britain and the colonies, where the Midwives Act were already in force. The first meeting of the Central Midwives Board met on the 1st of October 1918, and to mark this important centenary, on the 1st of October of this year, midwives and historians came together in the Pillar Room in the Rotunda with a stimulating programme discussing historical and contemporary perspectives in midwifery today. The 1918 meeting opened with a congratulatory note from Sir Francis Champneys, chairman of the English Board, who had earlier obstructed efforts to extend the Act to Ireland. On a more serious note, Champneys addressed the reciprocal arrangements stating that the cert of the Irish board will be acceptable by the English board, provided that the standard of training and examination in Ireland is equivalent to the standard adopted by the English board. So the midwife had a lot of paperwork. She kept a register, including the date she was engaged to attend, the mother, the time of her arrival at the labour, details such as the mother's obstetric history, the presentation of the fetus, the duration of the first, second and third stage of labour, any complications that occurred, were all noted. The gender of the infant, whether born live or dead, full term, premature, were all and a record of sending for medical help was also recorded. The midwife was never to leave the mother after the second stage of labour began and until the placenta had been expelled. The supervising authority was to be noted in all cases in which the death of a mother or child occurred before the attendance of the doctor. If an infant was born stillborn, without the presence of the doctor, this also had to be recorded. The role of the midwife in labour and in the immediate days after delivery was seen as vital, not just to combat puerperal fever by observing maternal morbidity, and at this stage, from 1913, that had been recognised as a pulse rising above 90 and a temperature of 99 degrees and continuing for 24 hours. But also she had a role in the care of babies, particularly with feeding and with the avoidance of ophthalmia neonatorum. There was an acknowledgement of the midwife's essential role in the provision of maternity services. Essentially, at this time, there just weren't enough lying-in beds in institutions around the country. The 1911 census returned a total of 365 institutional beds nationally. By March 1921, almost 3,000 midwives were on the midwives' roll. 160 of these women were in practice without certification, but satisfied regulatory authorities that they had the required experience. And we have the numbers there actually from all the various hospitals and including some from Ireland, the CMB already from Ireland, England and Scotland. Examinations were held at 6 monthly intervals in Dublin, Cork and Belfast, and exams were partly oral, partly practical and written, and included all of the subjects that the midwife was likely to meet in circumstances during her work. But disaster struck in Belfast in the form of an epidemic of puerperal fever. On 20th February 1920, the Public Health Department at Belfast Corporation noted an abnormal increase in the notifications of puerperal septicemia. Between 13th of December 1919 and in the following months of January until 20th of February, 21 notifications of infection were received by the department, 2 in December, 6 in January and 13 in February. Of that number of 21, 15 deaths occurred and 6 mothers recovered. These figures were stark when measured against notifications in previous years. In 1915, 16, 17 and 18, the entire number of notifications was 23. The corporation asked for the assistance of the local government board and inquiry took place in March 1920. It was hoped that it would trace the origin of the disease and elicit information that would lead to precautionary and preventative measures in the future. 12 doctors and 12 midwives and sanitary inspectors gave evidence. 3 features were conspicuous. Firstly, evidence pointed to a delay in notifying births. The 1907 Notification of Births Act demanded that fathers of birth attendants should notify the local medical authority within 36 hours of the birth. But the Act operated as a voluntary scheme for local authorities. Belfast began to implement the Act in 1908, Dublin in 1910, but many authorities did not engage with this Act until it became compulsory in 1915. In some cases in Belfast, up to 1 month elapsed before notification. There were approximately 40 births in Belfast every day. 13 midwives and 1 superintendent were employed by the corporation each day. With a lapse of 10 days, that would mean that up to 400 births needed to be notified at any one time, which left a very great potential for omission. Secondly, of greater concern were the failures under the Notifications of Diseases Act. In many cases, a considerable length of time elapsed between the birth and notification of puerperal infection. Maternal morbidity was recognised as a morbid state. This had been introduced, as I said already, into maternity hospitals in 1913, but was not widely practiced outside these institutions and in community settings. Delays in this regard were detrimental to the mother, with the danger of septicemia and death. Although the mother and infant were in the care of the midwife for 10 days after delivery, the interval between notification and death in most cases was short, suggesting that the mother was ill for some days before infection was recognised and notification took place. But in the case of Belfast, 4 of the women who developed puerperal infection were delivered in hospital, and 3 of these mothers died, notwithstanding asepsis and the utmost cleanliness being observed. I would suggest that puerperal infection could not be avoided, even with the best aseptic practice. The B. hemolytic streptococcus Lancefield group A was classified in the 1920s by the American bacteriologist Rebecca Lancefield. Puerperal fever was among the diseases which were caused by the bacteria, among erysipelas, scarlet fever, pharyngitis, and tonsillitis. It was not until 1935 that Dora Colbrick and Ronald Hare recognised the carrier ability of Group A streptococcus, providing evidence that organisms were very frequently transmitted not directly from primary source, such as hands, instruments, or clothing, but from a more immediate source, the throat and nose of a healthy individual. Thirdly, there was a suggestion that the 1918 Midwives Act had opened the door once again to bona fide midwives. 62 women of the 125 from Belfast arrived on the central midwives, the role, without training. At the time of the registration, the local government board had no power to refuse them and were obliged to place them in the register. Although blame was not apportioned to them and all the inquiry was sympathetic to their case, it concluded that a lack of knowledge and training led to incapable women once again being responsible for childbirth. Notwithstanding this, maternal mortality in Belfast halved during the 5 years that the corporation registered and supervised midwives. Just to conclude, implementation of the Midwives Act was carried out at local level. In Dublin, Cork and Belfast, maternity hospitals provided for the poor in their localities, absolving poor law guardians of that responsibility. Midwives continued to be appointed to dispensary districts. By 1920, there were 800 employed by the local government board. Their distribution was uneven and their caseloads were small. The board estimated that many midwives attended as few as 21 cases annually on a dispensary ticket. Explanations offered for this was that labouring classes were in more comfortable circumstances and would prefer a small fee for a midwife of their choosing. And many of these unqualified handy women who attended large sections of the poor, after independence, administering public health laws were to be centralised under the county councils. The supervision of midwives and the appointment of health visitors were patchy, and many variations in the standards of maternal and infant care throughout the country occurred. Many services were supplemented by district nursing associations, such as the Jubilee Nurse, or indeed the Women's National Health Association, who had about 150 associations around the country and had already been working with midwives since 1908. I have found no evidence that midwives had formed into a cohesive organisation of mutual support before the 1918 Act. The Nurses Act was passed in 1919. Following that, the formation of the Irish Nurses Union represented both nurses and midwives and was immediately aligned to the Irish Women's Workers' Trade Union, encouraged by its General Secretary Louis Bennett. The most urgent demand was to have the conditions of employment and salaries standardised. An increase in salary to £100 annually, travelling expenses, compulsory superannuation and 31 days holiday a year were called for. Another demand was the cooperation of medical men in refusing to work with untrained midwives. Ridding the profession of the untrained handywomen who were effectively in competition with midwives was a core priority of the union over the next number of years. Numerous representations to county councils and the Central Midwives Board, the Minister for Local Government and the maternity hospitals were made. Members were encouraged to use every means they could to educate the public to the dangers of engaging these women. Brooke Hegarty has suggested that after the 1992 Act, middle-class and upper-class midwives from the Midwives Institute in England actually tried to dissociate themselves from their working-class colleagues. I've actually found no evidence of this in Ireland. In fact, it seems that midwives got on very well with the medical officers. This is just anecdotal evidence. It's just work I'm going to do. It's a work in progress at the moment. And in fact, by the mid-1920s, when Joe Devlin, the secretary of the Central Midwives Board, died, his place was taken by a woman, and all of the administrative staff in the Central Midwives Board were women by then. Just with regard to migration, something that I'm also working at the moment, Jennifer Reid has talked about welfare agencies similar, run by the Catholic churches, for girls who might want to emigrate to England. I found actually no evidence that there were support networks for midwives, but what I did find actually was a lot of application forms for hospitals in Manchester, London and Liverpool, actually, and it seems to me that midwives were migrating to London but stayed in nurses' homes. Nurses' homes. Australia was another problem, actually, because the length of training there was 1 year as opposed to 6 months here. So the Midwives Act in Ireland lay the foundation for the professional development of midwifery in Ireland. The campaign for registration captured interprofessional rivalries which chiefly centred on competition. Like previous campaigns for professional status, debates and ultimatums usually led to negotiation and consensus. The prize of legislation was the first step towards professionalisation. Harold Perkins' study of the rise of professional society in England from the 1880s looks to how occupations formerly thought beyond the reach of professional aspiration demanded the status and rewards of a professional body with the benefits of income and security. Chris Nottingham, on the other hand, made further distinction within professional society, differentiating between higher professions and those he termed the insecure professionals, individuals who were working in emerging fields of education, health and civil service, who formed the core of middle-class society. Whichever model fitted into, the midwife fitted into, she had achieved the most outward expression of her status and identity, recognition of her profession through legislation. Thank you very much.